Hi and welcome to the Neil Ashton podcast. In each episode, we explain some of the fascinating ways that science and engineering are changing the world around us. We talk to leading engineers from elite level sports like cycling and Formula One, to some of the world's top academics to understand how fluid dynamics, machine learning, supercomputing are bringing in a new era of discovery. We also hear some of their life stories, their career advice, and lessons they've learned on the way that I hope will be helpful to you too. So sit back and enjoy this episode. Welcome back to the Neil Ashton podcast. So this episode's going to be a little bit different than the last two. I know I've said that in the past two episodes, but I guess this podcast is meant to be a bit varied on purpose. And it's just me today, no guest. But I wanted to cover a topic that I wish I had probably had more information on, which is essentially career advice, academia versus industry, the tech sector, how much can you get paid, what does it take to become a professor? So basically 5 or 6 things that I suppose I wish I knew when I was growing up and looking into a career into engineering. And I wanted to try and give you some information. This is all my opinion. It's based upon my life, my career, which is UK based. So I'm going to have a bit of slant, even though I work for an American company and therefore do have a reasonably sort of good sense of what's going on across the pond. So let's start off. Number 1, PhD or no PhD? Do you need to do a PhD to advance in the field of engineering and science? I would say yes, and I'll explain why. For me, if you go and do a master's or an undergraduate, you can be the smartest, best person, but there is, because of what you get taught, you're never an expert after that time. You may have developed skills, you may have learnt a good amount about your area, but they're not designed, these courses, to make you an expert in something. They're meant to give you a broad base, typically. You do often do a sort of dissertation in your 3rd or 4th year, depending if you're in the UK or Europe or the US. But by definition, really, a master's is about a grounding knowledge, or an undergraduate, and not becoming an expert or a specialism in a specific area. So if you look for a job after doing an undergraduate or a master's, many companies still see you as a graduate and see you as a more generalist that they can mold and adapt. So most companies, whether it's aerospace or mechanical or even the tech sector, are going to bring you into more generic engineering roles or generic data science roles, and you won't be a specialist. So the advantages of not doing a PhD are you're going to move faster into a paying job. So maybe if you're doing a standard thing at 21, 22, you're going to be starting to earn money. So in the UK, if you were to go into an engineering job, 30 to 40,000 pounds, maybe in the US, 50 to 60. We'll get on to later about the tech sector. Maybe it's a little bit higher, 60 or 70. Potentially a bit higher if you're in San Francisco or in the Bay Area. Maybe you might be earning $100,000 after a master's if you're in a sort of decent position. But the negative is that you're kind of similar to thousands and thousands of people across the world who have done an engineering undergraduate or master's. You can overcome that, of course, by doing extracurricular activities and doing the stuff in your own time. But that's that. Now, contrast that with if you have a PhD. A PhD forces you to basically have 3, 4, or 5 years extra education and extra time to become an expert in your area. A PhD, by definition, is quite narrow, so you become focused in something. So for me, it was not even just CFD, it was turbulence modeling within CFD. The pro is by the end of those 3 or 4 years, or even 5 years, you have become probably, let's say, only less than 100 people, maybe certainly in your country or maybe broader than your country, maybe even Europe or the US, know it as well as you do in your specific area. Very specific, but you have become an expert in something. Most of the time you will go therefore to company interviews potentially knowing as much or more than sometimes the person interviewing, because you've spent 3 or 4 years becoming an expert in that area. When I say no more than them, but you're up on the latest sort of advances. So you come in with a different mindset. You've also had the chance to broaden academically to other areas. You've had the opportunity to go to conferences, to see the sort of academic way of working, the writing style, the investigation style, the sort of culture it ingrains into you. You've maybe learnt more programming languages. You've done extracurricular activity, because often during a PhD, you've had time to do other things because of the nature of what it's like at a university. You've been able to explore the world a bit. Those are all advantages. And later we can talk about academia or industry. Obviously, PhD is an essential requirement, essentially, to go into academia. But what's the cons? The cons are that you are still in university and therefore you're getting paid less than if you were in industry. So PhD is equivalent of maybe £20,000 to £30,000 a year. I say equivalent because of the tax systems. Sometimes it can be a bit less, sometimes it can be a bit more. But remember, after 4 years or 5 years of a PhD, your take-home sort of salary equivalent, given that the people who have joined industry probably each year have been advancing, by the point when you graduate, maybe at 27, you may be now earning, £30,000 or half the amount that somebody else might be actually earning. So you have to factor that in. The other one is no one's going to let you buy a house on a PhD if you're the sole income. So you haven't been able to establish that sort of security in terms of buying place unless you already have the money from alternative sources. But you have set yourself up as an expert in something that I think has longer term implications. I'm biased. I did go down the PhD route, but I'll finish off by saying I think you should do a PhD because it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. It's almost impossible to do a PhD when you're older. It's very, very difficult to do it with family and work life and everything else and financially. So PhD, absolutely advise. Yes, there's issues with funding. You have to fund it. Typically, most people find some industry funding or university funding. So I'm not saying that it's possible for all. Also, where you want to do your PhD, it does matter where you do your PhD in terms of, the name of the university. It opens doors if you do it as a top tier university. But it's more important that you actually are motivated and you enjoy your time. PhDs have a very high failure rate. I don't know the current statistics, but it's probably at least half of people fail their PhDs or quit because after the first year, it's like, so you've really got to, one, be motivated to do it. So it's not an easy option. It's very independent. So you have to motivate yourself. It's tough. People get in difficult times. Again, you see other people moving on beyond, getting better jobs, getting more money, and you're still stuck doing your PhD, it can feel like. But if you pick the right supervisor, the right environment, it can actually be a very positive thing for you. So I think all in all, a PhD in the right topic that you're interested in and you really have a passion for, I believe, is the right decision. So on question number 1, PhD or no PhD, I would say PhD. Okay, second question. How do I become a professor? Well, first of all, interesting, the term professor is different in different countries. In the UK, and I think it's already kind of going out of fashion, it used to be lecturer, senior lecturer, reader often, and then professor. So only once you got to the top rank, you could call yourself a professor. I don't know if they started it, but the US, has, at least for as long as I know, has gone down the different route, which is assistant professor, associate professor, and professor. So at all points, people tend to still call you professor, even if you're not technically a full professor. And in Europe, it's a little bit similar, where people can still call you a sort of professor, but it's an interesting one that probably people who have worked hard to get to a full professor don't like people being called a professor in their earlier years, because there is potentially a difference. But anyway, when you hear someone say I'm a professor, often there is a different ranking system: assistant, associate professor. So how do you become a full professor? Well, I'm not a full professor, so I'm giving you based upon conversations with people, but I can give you at least the way I've seen it. So first of all, you've obviously had to do a PhD. I say obviously, you can be given an honorary professorship. I guess some people who went straight into industry and spent 30 years could be given some honorary, but today, as it stands, unlikely. You would almost certainly need a PhD. So you've done your PhD, you're, let's say, 27, again, assuming that you went to university at 18, and it depends in different places around the world. So first thing is, almost nobody becomes a professor after their PhD, or the first rank of being professor, which we'll call an assistant professor. Almost all need to do a postdoctorate research, postdoctoral research, PGR position. It's named different things in different countries and different universities. Essentially what it is a period of work, really now, or research after your PhD. When you're a PhD, you're still considered a student, a postgraduate student, but you're still a student. You have a supervisor. A postdoc is different because you're now essentially a contractor. That's the way I have now realized what it is. For people who are working in industry, a contractor is somebody who doesn't have a full-time permanent position, but somebody who is contracted to do work on a set time period. And in industry, that's used to fill gaps when you're not sure if you have long-term funding. Unfortunately, in academia, that is the standard for a postdoc. So for me, it's basically a contractor. So this is the first stage. You are typically given a 1, 2, 3, or very exceptionally 5-year position. Normally, it's funded through research. So what that means is later on, a professor has won some funding to do some research, and they will either get a PhD student to do that research. The negative being it takes a while for a PhD student to learn and be good enough to do it. Or they can get a postdoc, someone who's done a PhD, someone who is more productive and knowledgeable, and they will do the research. So what does a postdoc get you? Well, a postdoc now gets you more money. You are actually an employee of the university, not a student. Money is still not fantastic, relative scales to what we'll talk about later. You may be on 30 to 40,000 pounds. So I'm going to guess in the US, $80,000. Apologies, I could be off, but I'm just going to give a rough translation. It'll depend as well which university, where you're around the world. London pay a little bit more because London waiting. And so you'll be paid for that, and your job is to do the research. In some universities, you may also be asked to do some teaching. In the Oxfords and the Cambridges, that's a way to supplement your income at some of the colleges. In more traditional universities, normally you're not directly teaching, you may be helping. In the US, typically you do more teaching. It's sort of a rite of passage in a way that you'll be helping to do it. So it really does depend around the world. But during that time, you're doing research, and your aim, and I'm talking about the postdoc in the context of now becoming a professor, is to establish yourself as someone who could be an assistant professor. As in, you need to publish to prove to the community and to your peers that you are somebody that is qualified enough and ready to do their own independent research. A postdoc is normally doing research that has essentially been won or proposed by an assistant professor or higher. Occasionally, during a PhD, you can apply for a fellowship. A fellowship is something where you have written, although still likely with the help of some professor, a project that you want to get funding for to fund your postdoc. And that is highly advised and definitely a good stepping stone. So most of governments have these sort of funding. They're very sought after, but definitely a good idea, because if you win one, you've secured yourself probably 3 years of funding, sometimes a lot more. You've given yourself already a stepping stone of esteem because you've won some fellowship. And often those people then have a better chance of, moving towards something because they've already got a track record. During those, let's say 3 years, you have to publish like mad. You have to work hard and start interviewing straight away. I say this because this is the mistake I made. I mean, my career was a little bit different. I'll talk about that later. But during that time, you have to really go for it. The other thing is that now during that postdoc, most people say if you don't move out of a postdoc within 3 years, you're very unlikely to. And I've seen, and I didn't believe it at first, but now I kind of believe it. All of the funding mechanisms and the sort of way everything's done and the age that you are and the salary that you'll accept all gets harder the older you are. So those first 3 years, you have the best chance of making it. And you have to be fully prepared to move. Most universities only have 1 or 2 positions opening up for a new assistant professor in a particular topic. So statistically, it's most likely that you're going to have to move to another university or even another country. But let's just assume another university in your particular country to get that first level academic job. There are, again, sort of fellowships and schemes, but the universities are typically doing it to fill teaching needs, because primarily teaching is one of the ways that the university brings in the money to pay for a position. So if you are in charge of an engineering college, university, department, you need someone to help teach your courses. And as we'll talk about later, the older you get and the more close to get to a full professor, the less you want to teach. So you need these young blood coming in to do the teaching. So one of the primary focuses of hiring an assistant professor is to teach and to cover the teaching load. So they need to be able to do that. And that's where the funding comes in. And there can only be a couple of them because you only have a certain number of students. So this is why my point is you may have to move. So this is something, we'll look again, the negatives, academia or industry. This is something to be aware of. Let's assume now you do become assistant professor. Now, it depends in different countries, but in the US and increasingly also in some of the sort of top tier UK universities, that is still not a permanent position. That is still not a sort of lifetime position. That is what they call getting ready on, like sort of moving towards tenure. Tenure is really when you become an assistant professor. Now, I hope I'm not getting any of these terminologies wrong, and if I am, please write in the comments. But to the best of my knowledge, this is the way I've seen it. And I've got many colleagues and friends who are at various levels of being professors and not. So you go through that process, you become assistant professor, but that's not the end of the journey. Then you have to fight, pretty hard to get to the next level, which is your sort of permanent associate professor position. Now, in the US, that's typically 5 years. Sometimes it can be less in the UK, 3 to 5 years. It's kind of different in different universities. In the UK, sometimes they use the lecturer, senior lecturer titles, and sometimes your lecturer position could already be permanent. Like I said, more the top tier, they're trying to still whittle out, so they don't want to make permanent positions until you've got even further into your career. In the US, it's most definitely like that. You're assistant professor, you still are working to get that tenure of being an associate professor. So during those 5 years, you are like mad needing to publish, needing to bring money in, needing to get more students and teach. And this is probably one of the hardest periods. This is where the burnout happens. This is where people quit. It's like a triangle. You're a student at the bottom, PhD, postdoc, assistant professor. Bearing in mind now you're probably 30, 31 if you've gone through a standard sort of age thing. And you're still, in the UK, maybe only earning £50,000. I say only, it's all relative, to different where you are, what potential you get to. But you're working flat out, you're working weekends, you are traveling around. Academia at this time is one of the hardest jobs. And you have to be trying to establish yourself internationally as well as nationally, getting into doing publications and everything, and review and play the politics, trying to win them funding from different agencies and industry funding, and nurturing students, trying to get postdocs, trying to get PhDs, and then you make associate professor or senior lecturer. And I should be clear, some people never get beyond that. Some people never get beyond a senior lecturer or an associate professor. Now, bearing in mind you may be towards your late 30s at this point, or maybe even older, maybe in your early 40s or later, depending on how successful you've been. At this point, becoming a full professor becomes another sort of time-bound thing. You have to really establish yourself. You have to probably be taking on departmental duties. You have to be supervising 10 or 12 students. You have to be creating centers or new areas. You have to be on the international stage. You have to be called to panels. You have to be seen as an internationally leading person, editing maybe a journal or co-editing a journal. All this, and playing all the politics game, to become a full professor. And most people, if you're mid-40s and getting a full professor, you've done very well. Often people are in their 50s before they get a full professor, and some never at all. And this is, again, dependent on how ambitious the person is. And the starting salary of a professor, I just checked, I think in the UK, is about 70-something thousand. I say that because the next... So you've made it. Congratulations. You can now call yourself a full professor. And at that point, I would say from the professors that I know, this is when academia, in my opinion, becomes a very worthwhile place. Because you have reached the top, kind of. You are internationally known, you are regarded, you're an expert, you're secure, you've got a good salary, you can sort of pick and choose your teaching a little bit. And from that point on until you retire, you can sort of enjoy that period. It's still hard, don't get me wrong. Professors are working very hard, but there's a certain thing at that where I think you can enjoy the fruits of your labor. So that's a definite pro. But just consider all the stuff I've said of how to get there, which I would say the more esteemed the university, the harder that gets. Some people will end up jumping to a lower university to get that professor title because they think they can't get it in their current one. So there's a lot of moving around. But yeah, so that's the question. How do I get to be a professor? Of course, I could talk for hours about this more. I'm always interested in this kind of stuff, and I still go to lots of conferences and speak to people, so I'm always intrigued. And maybe I'm giving the harder bits of it. But anyway, I'd be interested if people have a similar experience. You should write in the comments or reach out to me. Okay, next question. Academia or industry? Often a question people have at the beginning of their career, at the middle, and the end. So let's now focus on an industrial career. And I'm going to use two different sort of places. I'm going to pick a Formula One team for people who are into Formula One, and maybe a sort of automotive or aerospace. Okay, so Formula One. So you finish your undergraduate and you try and get into Formula One. That's quite hard. Very tough to get into Formula straight after a master's degree undergraduate, because you are literally competing against thousands of people. If you come in at that time, you would be a junior. You'd probably be on 25, 30,000, like a pretty low salary. Formula One doesn't pay that great at the beginning. If you've done a PhD, you're 27, 28, you may come in at 40 odd, maybe 50. And apologies if some of my numbers are not spot on. And what you'll be doing? You'll be seen still as a graduate or a junior. For those first few years, you will just be doing what you're told. You'll be trying to be ambitious and progressing, but you'll be, a member of a team as an individual. And then maybe after 2 or 3 years, so maybe you're sort of in your mid to late 20s if you didn't do a PhD, or in your 30s if you did, you may move to being a sort of normal, let's say, aerodynamist. I'm going to take aerodynamics. At that point, you're still an individual, but you maybe are sort of shadowing a few juniors and graduates. You're helping them out a bit. And maybe your salary's got up to more like 50 odd or 60. next 3 years later, you may be trying to become a senior, or 3 or 4 years later. So maybe now a senior aerodynamicist or senior. And maybe now you'd be getting up to more like 80,000, 70, 80,000 as a senior. And maybe you're in your early 30s or mid 30s, depending on, when you started. I'm just going to pause there for a moment to realize that you could be a senior aerodynamicist earning £70,000 in your mid 30s or early 30s, earning the same as a full professor at university. That's true. Excluding, and I should have said in the previous one, some professors do supplement their income by doing consultancy work and startups and all this. But just bear that in mind. Formula One pays quite well. By your early 30s, you could be earning the same as someone who's probably in their mid 40s as a professor. Then you could spend another 3-4 years, let's say now. And by the way, I should say Formula One is incredibly tough working hours. Very, very difficult. So potentially working on weekends, although I'd say in academia sometimes it's even harder working in the earlier years, sort of tie it between the two. You could then become like a principal or a deputy principal. So this is after maybe 8 to 10 years of being in. So you're in your sort of mid 30s to late 30s. Some of the people that I know are, sort of principals who started at similar time, or maybe sort of a deputy team leader. And now they could be earning £100,000 a year, bit more, a bit less. You move on a little bit, but now you're having to really manage a team more, potentially. You've got people underneath you when you're certainly a principal or a team leader. So let's say you go a little bit further again, another 3-4 years. Maybe now you could be a sort of deputy team or deputy head of aerodynamics. Maybe you're in your mid 40s, early to mid 40s. You could be earning now 150, 170, 200,000 pounds. So well beyond what a professor earns. So if you look equally at someone who's in their mid 40s, and maybe they'll become a deputy head of aero, or even a head of aero, where maybe they're earning 250,000, 300,000, or even more, depending on the team. The time it takes for you to get to that position, the time it gets you to academia, is you can see why at all those points there are some people who question, should they stay in academia? Now, I would argue at that point, the stress level when you're a deputy or a head of aerodynamics versus the stress level when you're a professor, I would argue that, and job security, you're probably far more secure in your academic job as a full professor. And you could top up your money, quite well by being such a world expert. You could be earning £200,000 in total if you, do lots of consultancy work and you'll have a little startup on the side like many do, all within the rules. And I say the starting salary for a professor is 75, let's say in the UK, but they get higher and higher. There's incremental, so they could be over 100 by the time they're in their 50s or more, depending on the university, if they're really esteemed. And but they're still quite far off, let's say, Formula One. And if you get even higher in Formula One, people are earning $500,000 or more. But they're exceptional. That's, sort of team principal or very high up. But that's not the norm of standard engineering industry. If you were at a sort of car company, Jaguar Land Rover, all you have to do is look at job adverts. You are going to be earning less than that. Your working hours are probably going to be a little bit easier. Formula One is known to be difficult. But you may be earning, 40 to 50,000 in your late 30s to 40s, or you could be earning 60, 70, a bit more. But what are you going to be doing? Well, at that point, you are going to be in a more corporate company, of course. I should say the university is very hectic, but you have a lot of freedom on your time. You're kind of like your own boss in a way at a university. It's always known that they're all like little CTOs, a professor, like they're running their own little company. So it's a very different lifestyle. You have a lot more freedom in a way. But in the industry one, you're part of a company. There's corporate structures often if you're in a larger company. And the way to progress is usually by managing people. And this is true of in academia. In a way, you're often managing a group of students and postdocs and teaching, and engineering the same. So the question becomes academia or industry. I would say you have to do both. Now, I'm biased because I've split my time a little bit between two. I think if you only go down the academic route, you will never be as knowledgeable as if you had spent some time in industry, because it is fundamentally just a different place to work. It's a different attitude on what is engineering. I'm talking from an engineering side. There's certain stuff that you only realize, now I understand why. You understand the mindset, the culture, not only the science and the practical engineering, but just the way that industry works. But equally, if you've only been in industry, I think it's a shame that you're not seeing the good side of academia and the way to stretch your mind and to work with students. And the good thing, there are schemes that allow the movement of both sides. So there are people who move from academia to industry, either permanently or through sort of like secondments. And increasingly, there's also the other way around, where academics can go into industry for a year or sort of time periods. Now, I could end the episode there, and I would say that would be a fair reflection of, certainly in the UK, again, it's kind of the angle I can say, is what I certainly knew up to, let's say, 4 years ago. I thought that was basically it. Formula One's sort of the best paying job, but most industries somewhere in the middle. You have academia, you have the pros and cons. But then there's another option. And I think in the US, this was far more known, which is the tech sector, which is the Amazons, the Apples, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Microsoft, I'm probably missing out names, and the sort of associated startups and companies that surround those sort of big tech companies. Now, you could also argue, to be fair, that the Teslas and those are kind of like tech companies, and Nvidia, sorry, I missed out Nvidia. That's another option that I would highly recommend people think about. Now, I'm biased because I work from those companies, but this is in no way me trying to say come and work for AWS, not at all. I'm just saying as a sector. So what is it? Tech companies are now into many areas of engineering because the advent of machine learning and computer science and numerical methods and high-performance computing, engineering is no longer just with your hands building something. It is inherently a computer thing, and increasingly now machine learning. So the closeness, it used to be that it was only computer science people who went to work for tech companies, just developers. Increasingly now, I'm seeing a lot more people come from engineering backgrounds to go into tech companies because they're working on more tech problems. Robotics or computing or fluid dynamics, or there are a lot more opportunities. So if you are early on in your career and you've just come out from doing an engineering undergraduate or master's, it may be that actually, instead of you going to the classic car company or aircraft company, you may consider looking at a tech company. Now, you may need to slightly change your skill set, focus more on the sort of data science and the computing a little bit, particularly in those early stage jobs, because that is, the most jobs. Cloud computing is massive. High performance computing or computing from the chip companies, AI now, so many AI companies. So where do they differ? Well, they are first of all, if you go and do a PhD, let's assume you've done a PhD. It certainly makes it easier. Postdoc is not a permanent position. Tech company is a permanent position. So, for most companies anyway. So you've got a postdoc that pays maybe like 40k, 45k, and a starting tech sector job that may be paying more like 70k or 80k. And if you're in the US, you're talking even higher than that, like in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, low hundreds for like someone after their PhD. So you're like, oh, okay. So that's actually a really good salary. So someone just after their PhD could potentially 60, 70,000. Now, I'm not talking about banking or the financial sector because I know, but it's important for me to say that because a lot of engineers thought the only way that I can get a really good salary is to go and work for a consulting or a banking company instead of engineering. And what I'm saying to you is there is another alternative, which is into the tech sector, which increasingly is now becoming quite a broad sector. So you don't have to abandon engineering to, go into the finance sector or go into, you can stay as an engineer, but into the tech sector. This is something I had no clue about. Didn't even know about these companies until I was, until 4 or 5 years ago. So, and how do they progress? Well, it is tough. If you join after your PhD in tech company, that is, you are still at the sort of bottom end of the ladder, and you're going to have to work hard to really differentiate, even with a PhD. You're going to have a tough job, but as you progress, your salary is going to be even surpassing sort of Formula One, to the point that if you're into your sort of early 40s, let's equate these different roles. Well, let's forget about salary for a moment. So for the tech companies you move through, you can progress from a sort of, they have different leveling systems. There's lots of websites on there that show them sort of standard, up and going to a normal, to a senior, to a principal, to a senior principal. Interestingly, most tech companies allow you to stay as an IC, an individual contributor, if you want to. Like, I am an individual. I don't manage anybody. I personally like that. There aren't many companies that you can keep progressing and never had managed anybody. And what's it like? Well, it's kind of exciting because you're in a fast-moving environment. So I'd say the tech sector has a lot of analogies with academia. And that's why, actually, of all the people who are assistant professors or postdocs, I see so many of them who have actually moved over to the tech sector, either before they became an associate professor, assistant, as an associate, or even as a full. But we'll talk about a full in a minute, because I think that's what's an interesting distinction. So if you were to go through that route, and let's now compare. So you've got someone who's, let's say, an associate professor at the end of their 30s, earning £65,000-70,000, or maybe $150,000-60,000, massively dependent on which university you're in the US. You've got someone who's in industry, who's maybe earning £50,000-60,000, so not that different between maybe an associate professor and someone in industry, depending on how far they've advanced in their age. And then you have someone who in the tech sector who could be earning £150,000 or more. So it's almost double the salary. And in the US, you could have somebody who's earning $400,000. So many of these people are thinking, why am I working so hard in academia? I can just get paid so much more and just join a tech company. Now, you lose some of the freedom of the academia, of course, but it's kind of interesting, that move. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some top US universities who pay very high to take an average sort of thing, and particularly in the UK. So, I know I'm jumping around all the place, but I think this is sort of interesting. What about a full professor? So you're a full professor. You may be on £80,000-90,000, or in the US, maybe, let's say, $300,000 or even higher. But then you look at a tech sector and you think, hold on, I'm a full professor. I'm one of the top people in the world. I reckon I could probably move there. And what happens is, yes, they could, and they're really valued, particularly, let's say, people in machine learning. And so they may be offered a role at a tech company where, let's say in the US, they're paid $1 million. Or in the UK, maybe 400,000 or 500,000, unfortunately. Salaries in the UK are quite a lot lower than the US. So basically, they could be earning twice or 3 times as much as what they earn at the university. And that is why a lot of universities have said, well, how about we give you a dual position? You can have both. And that is why, if you look at almost all of the top tech companies, there is almost always the person who's like one of the top VPs of sort of science or whatever, is almost always also having as an academic position. And I'm obviously basing this only on some conversation, but most of the time it's because the universities had to do that to keep them, because if not, they're going to go anyway. It's also a little bit the other way around, where the tech company may want access to that academics, research group and their students, and so they want to do it. But so I'm rambling around. What's my conclusion to this? and these podcasts have already been too long, so I'll summarize this discussion. Starting from the beginning, PhD or no PhD? Do a PhD, it's worth it in the long run. How to get a professor, long role, but be aware that, as I kind of said and didn't say, there is more than one route. One route is the pure academic route, but there is routes where you jump in and out, and you particularly come back when you've made it more in industry. And you do see that in a lot of universities where people have sort of come and gone a little bit. So bear in mind, it's a long journey, but it's worth it once you get right to the top. But, just have the conviction that to go for it. Academia or industry? Difficult. Academia, once you get to the end, I think looks fantastic, but I do see people burn out and really struggle. So, it's a tough one. Industry can be good, a lot more permanent basis with work. If you things like Formula One can pay very well. But, which is kind of a little bit the concluding thought on this, be aware of the opportunity that's coming through sort of tech companies, particularly in this age of AI. I wish I'd known about this. That's why I'm really doing this episode, because I wish I'd known this when I was an undergraduate. I'm glad in some ways I didn't, because I like the route that I've taken, but I wish I'd known, because I think maybe I would have been more educated about the opportunities out there. Okay, now I work for that company, but I think, what would it have been like if I'd have done that? So I really wanted to do this episode just to make people aware. Like I said, I could talk about this for hours, because it really is, there's so many nuances, and I've probably made some things generalized too greatly or not. But I'm hoping you find this useful, particularly if you're maybe a bit younger and you don't really know what sort of roles and positions are out there. And please do let me know if you found this useful, because I'm happy to record more episodes like this. And I think the next few episodes are going to be back to the normal interviewing guest about interesting things in science and engineering. But I wanted to try this format to see how it goes. So thanks for listening.